Good morning, everyone that's already with us. We'll just give it a couple of seconds to let the last few attendees trickle in, and then we will begin. Okay, I think just in the interest of time, we will start and we'll let any other attendees join when they're ready. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this techUK webinar on the evolving role of open source intelligence, sponsored by techUK member Fivecast. For those of you who don't know me or haven't met me before, I'm Raya. I lead our national security programme here at techUK, and I will be chairing today's session. So I'll start with just a brief introduction and some housekeeping rules from my side. We've got a really exciting list of speakers ready for today's session who will be delivering the webinar this morning, during which you would have noticed that you've automatically had your microphones muted and your cameras off to minimise disruption. The session after the main bulk of discussion will end with a Q&A from the audience. So during the presentation, please do drop any comments and questions into the chat of this call. I'll be monitoring it and we'll read some of the questions at the end. And just to let you know that this session is also being recorded and will be shared with attendees after the call. So as I mentioned at the start, I'm delighted to share that this webinar is sponsored by techUK member Fivecast. Fivecast are a world-leading provider of digital intelligence solutions which deploy advanced data collection and AI-enabled analytics to solve the most complex intelligence challenges within national security. They're based in Australia with an established presence in the US, the UK and Europe. And Fivecast is also part of the trusted Five Eyes Alliance and was born out of a unique collaboration between government agencies and world-leading research institutions to tackle big data challenges within both national security and law enforcement as well. So Fivecast will today be joined by a panel of both industry and academic experts as we delve into all things open source intelligence, with the aim being to hopefully shed some light on how it's not merely keeping pace with change, but also leading the charge in revolutionizing intelligence as we know it. So to begin, today we're joined by three speakers. I'll give each one 2 minutes to do some brief introductions. So starting with Dwayne.
Thanks, Ryan. Just coming off mute. So I'm one of the co-founders of Fivecast. I'm our Vice President of Strategic Growth. I'm based in our headquarters in Adelaide, Australia, but right now I'm visiting, so I'm sitting here in London. So thank you for having me. As Raya said, our mission is all about enabling a safer world at Fivecast. We are a global provider of open source intelligence solutions. We have offices. We have an office here in London. We have an office in DC. And also an office in Australia. So we have built our technology to solve a range of use cases for our customer base. We mainly sell into the national security, law enforcement, intelligence, border agencies, and we help them solve the complex challenges in everything from risk prioritization for counterterrorism, extremist threats, insider risk, foreign influence, supply chain risk management, force protection, fraud detection. The list goes on, but it's probably enough from me, and I'm happy to hand it back to Ryan. We'll talk some more.
Thanks, Dwayne. Great insight to start. So handing over to Maria.
Hi, everyone. I am Maria. I'm a research fellow at the Changing Character of War Centre at Oxford University, and we are inside Pembroke College. And I am talking to you today as a practitioner, so someone who's used OSINT a lot, but also has helped other people use OSINT and use OSINT better. I've overseen multiple projects that were purely OSINT based, but that were informing the national security and law enforcement community. I've also done this sort of work in academia, as you could guess, because that is my home at the moment. And I've also done this sort of work in the private sector, so helping with due diligence and that sort of investigations. I am mainly looking into malign influence, using all levers. I'm looking at all levers of power, but my main focus in research is the analysis and influence of strategic behavior, and I use open source intelligence to do these sort of investigations.
Thanks, Maria. And Caroline.
Hello, everybody. My name's Caroline. I have recently just left government service after nearly 22 years. I have a background in intelligence and law enforcement, particularly in the national security space. And I've just recently moved in the last 6 months to SAS, which is one of the global leaders in AI and data analytics, as one of their principal consultants, covering, as you would imagine, defense, intelligence, and law enforcement. So we have a little bit of experience of working with Fivecast, and sort of working together to see how our products can align, and we can use the insights that they derive from their OSINT and pull it into our data analytics platform and sort of seamlessly integrate all that together. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Caroline, and thanks all for those brief introductions. So I think to kick things off in the main chunk of the discussion, it's important to kind of understand why we're here today and why we're hosting this webinar. I think as the digital landscape becomes more accessible and people obviously move a lot more of their lives online, open source intelligence, or OSINT as we know it best and as has already been labelled, is emerging as sort of the cornerstone of the intelligence community and has become an essential source for law enforcement, defence intelligence, national security, and also corporate organisations worldwide. And as I'm sure you'll imagine, I think it's fair to say that the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine signalled a step change in the way in which Western governments think and communicate about intelligence, using publicly available information to create OSINT, which provides quite critical insight, which is now being recognised as an increasingly important way to kind of deliver an effective national security posture. I think one of the main obvious examples of where we saw this throughout the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine was the daily briefings from organisations such as UK Defence Intelligence on the conflict on platforms such as LinkedIn, so sharing details about airstrikes, civilian displacement, territorial gains, and sort of everything in between. So I guess my first question to Maria is, despite this not being a brand new phenomenon, how far do you think we've come in terms of the breadth of current applications of OSINT across UK national security? And, where are we on that journey?
I think the best way to structure the answer to that question is to look at what's become easier, what's become harder, and what has essentially stayed the same, or what is still hard. As a practitioner, what has become easier is that there's more information and data out there for everyone. Everyone who has access to a computer or a phone or a tablet with internet can technically do OSINT, which means that there's a very low barrier. Again, many people can actually go and do it. And if you combine this with a really high volume of both structured and unstructured data, there are a lot of opportunities. And you've really seen these opportunities, I think, grow. You can really see that in the past, I would say 5 years, OSINT has become quite a mainstream thing to do. And there's some pros and cons, which I'll get to later. But what I found really interesting is that it's made for some really interesting innovation opportunities, both in terms of tools, but also in terms of methodology and training. So it's much easier now to get training on how to do OSINT well and to do OSINT safely, because that is often a bit overlooked. But also there are now tools available that didn't used to be available that help you structure that data and to find the right data as well, because that's not necessarily easy either. What we've seen in that, I think, is also an increased public-private collaboration that didn't used to be there when we started out years and years ago. That was a lot harder, and that's a lot easier now. I think it's also, because it's become more mainstream, it sounds really simple, but there's a lot more investigative journalism out there. Because also for them, it's become a lot easier to do this sort of research because of the availability of information. And for me as an analyst or leading teams of analysts, that's been really helpful because it just means that if people have already done some research for the public good, for public interest, it just often means that if you're looking into something that is not too niche, there's already something out there about it. And that just is nice to not have to start completely from scratch. I briefly mentioned tools. It is amazing that they are out there, and I'll get in a bit as to why that is so important, but it just makes that your research and analysis, that you can do that so much more efficiently, and which makes it easier to do. So it just also makes it easier to help your team do it well. Because you just have a little bit more, they have a little bit more structure into their investigations. It makes it faster. I can do investigations now that used to take me weeks. I can now do in hours, which is really good. And it also means that we can do it more safely, again, often overlooked. A tiny point, but important, is that satellite imagery has just gotten a lot better. It's easier to see things from satellites, things that we didn't used to be able to do before in the open domain that we are now. It's become more accepted as a means of investigation, which again helps with the public-private collaboration, both in terms of innovation and developing tools, but also just that when you do these type of research, it is seen as something serious. So what's gotten harder, 10, 15 years ago, you could go on Facebook and you could just quite efficiently search that platform, and you wouldn't necessarily be detected as either a bot, but also just as a human who was using that platform for something that it wasn't for. That isn't possible anymore. Not without tools. It's really hard to now just go into a social media platform and search into a person of interest without having a tool. So that's why these tools are incredibly important. I've worked with them and without them, and I can tell you that without these tools, proper social media research has become, I would say, virtually impossible. One other downside of OSINT having become quite mainstream is that there are no standards. And I know that there's people actually in the industry that are working on improving this, but at the moment there are no industry standards. And there's a lot of mushrooming companies and people who say, but I do OSINT. And it's actually really difficult to see who's really good and who's just saying that they are doing that. And I'm really glad that there's people actually that's caught their eye, and they are and that they are working on that. What stayed the same? Good OSINT isn't easy. Good OSINT isn't easy, and it takes a lot of work. Tools can help to make things easier and safer and more efficient, but it doesn't take away that you really have to put a lot of work in order to do it well. These tools aren't going to remove that. Not going to remove all of the effort. The other things that tools are not going to completely remove is biases and assumptions. Tools can help with that, but the risk of getting things wrong cannot be completely removed, and so there always needs to be someone in there, a good OSINT analyst, that puts in the work, puts in the time, and gets the right assessments out.
Thanks very much, Maria. Very, very good insight there. And moving on to Dwayne, but sort of sticking on the topic of that increased innovation and using OSINT to build out a more accurate threat intelligence picture. I think it's obviously important to also mention sort of the buzzword in recent tech advancements. How do you, Dwayne, think that artificial intelligence and deep learning is enhancing intelligence efforts in predicting and preventing emerging threats? So, what are Fivecast doing in particular on that topic?
Sure. Thanks, Raya. I think maybe just to riff off what Maria was just talking about, I thought maybe I'll just almost go back to basics and what are we talking about when we're talking about OSINT data And because people think of the obvious ones, and OSINT isn't a new thing. Open source intelligence is not a new thing. Even back 70 years ago, people were reading newspapers to get information from the open source. So maybe just to paint a bit of a picture there, most people think of things like social media platforms, but we're also talking about things like search engines, news sites, court records, dark web marketplaces, forums, crypto sites, sanctions, PEPs, watch lists, data breaches, databases. So anything that you can essentially get. And nowadays, we always think about it getting it from a Chrome browser, anything you can get from a Chrome browser. But the sheer volume of that data is really the main issue that Maria was touching on before. Just to throw out some stats, on average, we spend over 2 hours a day online, over an average of sort of something like 6 to 7 platforms. So it's not just the mainstream platforms. We have to think about the proliferation of different platforms, the Discords, the Reddits, the 4chans, etc. So that's really the challenge. Sorry, the lights have just gone off. The challenge is, how do we make understanding of the online world, and how do we understand online complexity? You also have to think about the format that all the data is in. So we're talking text, we're talking images, we're talking videos, we're talking networks between individuals that are interacting on some of these platforms. And there is just so much data. How do you find the right piece of data that you need to actually solve that problem? We talk about this, finding the needle in the haystack, finding the hidden connection, and there's an evolving threat landscape. And what we've seen, if we go back several years to the ISIS years, and then we look at content moderation, the kinds of people that we're chasing, or that our customers are looking at, which were maybe on the mainstream platforms 5 years ago, have been kicked off due to content moderation. So they've had to go somewhere else. They've had to find a new platform. A great example is post-January 6, there was this realization that the people involved in planning January 6 had done a lot of it on Parler. And if you remember what happened there, is post-January 6, Parler was deplatformed. Their cloud provider pulled the plug. They were kicked off the Google Play Store. They were kicked off the Apple App Store. And that data went dead. But those people weren't on the mainstream platforms. So in just setting the scene, there's so much data, and you actually need to find the right people. The other thing is, how do you find accounts online that are actually linked to an individual? So if I'm one of our customers, I'm in law enforcement, national security, and I'm looking for Bob Smith, how can I be sure that the account that I'm looking at, or the information I'm looking at, is related to the Bob Smith I'm looking for? And we've all probably done open source intelligence ourselves on our you might be applying for a job and you go on a certain platform and look up who you're meeting with. I had a meeting with someone yesterday and I looked them up online, just on Google, to get some information about that person before I actually met with them. So, but what Maria was going into is, how do you actually work through this in a automated way? And how do you use AI to optimize what you're doing? So we really see our value in several different ways. So we see it in finding the information that is related to the human being in the real world, which is relevant to that human being. So where are they online? What do we know about them? And can we find that that's the right account? We're very focused on entity-centric analysis. So our customers come to us and say, we're interested in an individual, we're interested in a group. Just to set the scene, we're not hoovering up the internet and putting an AI lens and finding the bad guy. We're very much focused on entity-centric analysis and collecting the information that's relevant to the open source intelligence analyst to put that in their hands. There is still a huge amount of information that is then collected. That information needs to be saved. It needs to be analyzed. It could be images, it could be video. You could sit there and watch hours of, the analyst can sit there and watch hours of video, or maybe they actually want an AI to go across to find, say, an image with a weapon, or image with drug paraphernalia, rather than so they can actually use their time on achieving the mission, not finding the right accounts or watching hours of video or looking at thousands or hundreds of thousands of images, reading all the content. How can you use the AI to actually empower? And it's really about tipping and queuing and flagging the information that the analyst should be looking at and saying why it has flagged that information to the analyst. And why we do that, it's all about a force multiplier. Maria touched on it before, but this idea, what she said is what used to take me weeks now takes me hours, because you're not, it takes the bulk of the sort of monotonous work of just reading all the content to find the information you're looking for, to actually tip that to the top of the queue so the analyst can go in and dive in and actually look at that information and then make their product, their analytical product or their intelligence from this sea of information.
Thanks so much, Dwayne. Moving away from kind of the national security applications that we've discussed so far and looking at OSINT in the context of kind of enterprise security, for example, Caroline, are you able to delve a bit deeper into any real-world scenarios where kind of these advanced data collection techniques safeguard against a different type of threat? So just picking out kind of insider threat as an example, but feel free to add any more.
So insider threat, I think it's one of the most obvious areas in which OSINT can provide valuable insights. So in terms of employee background checks, either before hiring or before giving existing employees additional accesses or renewing existing access rights to sensitive material, as in the case of certain roles that require ongoing vetting. You can get a really good contextualized idea of the activities, attitudes, conduct, history, and associations of an individual from a variety of OSINT resources. And it can also highlight or give an indication of changes in behavior, unexplained wealth, expressions of dissatisfaction with employers, other behaviors and other indicators that could be potential flags for insider threat. It can also help to identify, I think, areas of vulnerability and potential exploitation through, for instance, social engineer attacks, so phishing, basically, and allow security professionals to identify and get ahead of these risks by providing tailored advice and support to those who might be particularly vulnerable, for instance, high profile or senior members of an organization. That's what we call whaling attacks, I love it, or those who repeatedly fail phishing awareness training or systems tests to try and identify that. This can also extend, of course, to monitoring supply chain risks, assessing the security of third-party vendors, suppliers, partners, all of which is really important in building and maintaining a resilient digital economy. And just as an aside on that, there's lots of really good open source information available about enterprise security and how to build cyber resilience into the heart of your organization and your business strategy. So in particular, I'd highlight the NCRCG, which is the National Cyber Resilience Center Group. They can give practical support, advice, and guidance to small and medium-sized enterprises throughout the UK, and also the NCSE, which is the National Cybersecurity Centre. They're a government agency and they can provide advice and guidance on cybersecurity as well.
Thanks, Caroline. And some good recommendations there at the end for actual organisations to go to for guidance. I think kind of opening up the discussion out to any of you guys who would like to jump in and picking out a different topic now of organised crime networks as a growing threat to UK security, which we've seen. Can you perhaps comment on sort of both challenges and opportunities for law enforcement to stay one step ahead of such networks using capabilities such as OSINT? And I'll probably bring in Maria first, and then anybody could jump in after.
So maybe I just focus on the opportunities. because there are really quite a lot. But just maybe then to start off with the challenges, of course, when things happen in a world in which secrecy is really, really important, people are obviously going to be a little bit careful with putting things just online. But that doesn't mean that OSINT isn't helpful. It's on the contrary, actually. I think the main opportunities are both in the generation of leads, as well as in the sort of the validation and giving contextual information. And specifically in a context where you maybe don't have so many people available or so many other means, I think OSINT is a really low impact way in which you can, which these sort of OSINT investigations can help your larger investigations. So just give you a couple of examples with leads. So platform and the online, sometimes targeted advertisements, I think they can provide quite good leads because although these things, if you are talking, for example, about human trafficking or drugs or exploitation, online is like any other organization where your customers are. And so that's where the advertising happens, and that's where some of the networking happens, because even though you don't want to be communicating about it too openly, you do need to communicate about it in a way that's relatively open, because otherwise, essentially, like in any normal business, you can't reach your target audience. And I think these opportunities are the largest when it comes to drugs. I know in the Netherlands, they recently actually did a documentary about it, which was quite good for anyone who happens to be speaking Dutch. But there are certain platforms on which drugs ads are so large that the challenge to police is not necessarily even finding it. It is what do you do with all that information and how do you structure it? So yeah, so that I think a really good opportunity for leaders, these sort of things. Again, I'm mentioning it, investigative journalism groups, especially when it comes to organized crime, because there is a public interest in this. There are investigative journalist groups that have already done a lot of work into looking into essentially who's doing what, and this can actually give you surprisingly good leads. Again, if you're starting from scratch, that is a really good place to start. But in addition to that, also just general reporting and even crime blogs. I must admit, I don't know if this is a big thing in the UK, but it is in the Netherlands. Obviously, the challenge is that you have to check and verify what you read there, because they don't uphold to the same standards as a journalist would have to do. But there's quite often, just in the open, quite a lot of interesting information in there, which law enforcement can just use without having to send someone out there to just go and check it out. One example that is, I think, an interesting crossover between leads and contextual information, and I think this is especially so for exploitation and trafficking, money laundering, is the company aspect. So if you can find out essentially who owns what, who owns which sort of company, what other companies are they linked to, what other people are they linked to, and if you can then combine that with larger information, who are they in general associated with, where are these companies located, I found that can really help you in investigations in the specific areas that I've mentioned. And then also you can then, if you can then find out, for example, where these companies are, that then helps you to do another sort of crossover into, say, satellite imagery, which will really helps you find out, does this building, for example, look like it's being used for what it says it's being used for? And again, you can do all of that in person. You can send someone around and check, does that look okay or does it not? But obviously that takes a lot of manpower, and often law enforcement doesn't have that. I think also with OSINT, it just allows you a bit easier to work with people who are not necessarily within the organization. So there is an opportunity for outside people to help you, because it is in the open, the information that you're working at is almost by definition not secret, and that really helps. It then probably becomes secret after, but that they don't have to necessarily worry about that yet. I thought a really fairly recent, interesting example of where validation in context, if you already have a lead, was really interesting, is with the PGP hacks. I think the technical term is not hacks, but PGP, for people who don't know, is pretty good privacy. There are several platforms that have recently or in the past couple of years been hacked, for lack of a better word, by law enforcement. EncroChat is a really big one. These are easy examples to use because they've been reported in the media, and so it's easy to talk about them. But these are organizations. It's a little bit like WhatsApp or Signal. You can just talk freely about what you are doing in your criminal organization without anyone reading with, because the encryption is really good, except for, of course, if the police or any other law enforcement hacks into it and they can read what you do, which is what happened not too long ago with the EncroChat platform. And the problem they then had is that they had all of this information, way too many data points to even analyze by just with a human head. But the main information, the main difficulty in general that they had was that they couldn't link who the account belonged to, because obviously that is not registered. But what you did see is that people were sharing lots of information within these chats. So they were talking about their kid's birthday, their dogs, the cars they bought, and things like that, because they were safe. Using OSINT is a really good, that would be a really good opportunity for using OSINT, where you have all of that, and that allows you then Elite to go and find where you can validate that information. Can you find someone who has these cars? Can you find someone who has been showing this sort of behavior online? And that is, as Caroline already talked about, as well, the same in normal due diligence. That is not just an opportunity. That is only there for law enforcement. That is, that's for both.
Thanks, Maria. Caroline, did you perhaps want to jump in on this question as well?
Well, I suppose I'd offer as an opportunity, if you take the example of human trafficking and modern slavery, OSINT has been really valuable, both in identifying and tracking enablers and assets. So things like vehicles, routes, stop-off points, and all of these provide opportunities for interdiction. They can highlight money trails and ultimately aid in identifying the criminal gang behind the operation and support the building of an evidential case. Very quickly, a couple of the challenges I'd highlight. Number one, the sheer volume of data. And as we know, it's growing exponentially. There's different types of data, which Dwayne's already touched on, but there's different types of data as well. I think when we're getting into sort of extended reality spaces, as we are in certain crime types at the moment. So volume and complexity of the data. The second challenge I'd drop in here is the digital skills gap. So I think it's fair to say that this does exist across the public sector writ large, and policing, for example, is no exception. And this gets harder to bridge with the continual and rapid evolution of technology, the proliferation of social media platforms and so on. But I think that's something that, Dwayne, you're going to perhaps want to speak about later on in the session when we're thinking about how we might successfully address that.
Thanks, Caroline. Dwayne, did you want to wrap up this question for us?
Sure. Well, I guess just pivoting back to the organised crime, and I always think, and I've had this question before, people say, I'm sure these people don't put this information online. And I think my response to that is you'd really be surprised at how much information is freely shared that you might think if you were engaging in these types of activities, you wouldn't actually put it online. I would like to bounce off a point that Maria made as well. It's about stitching together. I listed a whole bunch of data sources before, and Maria mentioned a couple before. If you can find something on a platform, a networking site, and then you can stitch that together with company directories or understand a network about who they're connected to, and stitch together all these different types of open source intelligence, lots of analysts will use network analysis, because that's really the key part of, say, an organised crime network. Who are they connected to? We did a case study recently. It was something along the lines of, so in Australia we have organised outlaw motorcycle gangs, which are our sort of organised crime networks, and we call them the bikie gangs. And the case study was bikie by day, real estate agent by day and bikie by night. And this guy basically has multiple accounts, one in which he's wearing his suit, covering up his neck tattoos, and the other one he's in his, bikie uniform on another site. And it's really about tying those pieces of information together. And so much of it is out there. It's just about finding the information and stitching it together. So they're probably enough on that one. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Dwayne. And sort of staying on the topic of exploring some challenges to progress in the national security community engagement with OSINT as kind of that core investigative tool, I think you can pick out and categorise it into two initial challenges that we've touched on. So firstly, and also noting Zoe Walters' question in the chat, definitely the ethical considerations within OSINT investigations, and secondly, Caroline touched on this already, but the approaches to training and upskilling digitally enabled staff, both in actually private and public sectors, organisations, to be able to use OSINT effectively. So pairing it with the question in the chat from Zoe on ethical considerations, perhaps coming to you, Caroline, can you share some insight into the ethical considerations associated with OSINT as a law enforcement investigative tool as well?
Sure. Well, let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. Of course, it is a matter of public record that concerns, which ultimately led to the Anderson Review, which was entitled "To Question of Trust," published in, I think, mid-2015. The concerns had been raised that utilising OSINT and other covert tactics could subject citizens to a level of unseen, unaccounted for surveillance, which might be at odds with expectations around democratic principles and rights. So I suppose one of the key considerations for law enforcement is how do they maintain the public's trust and confidence in how it's investigating and prosecuting crimes through the range of tactics that are available through its use of OSINT. So key, I suppose, to achieving this is by being both transparent and accountable for the use of these capabilities. Now, I don't want to get involved in a discussion around the legislative frameworks, the regulatory, the oversight bodies that exist in the UK, which govern this area. Suffice to say, the sheer existence of these represent an important foundation and a mechanism by which law enforcement can demonstrate transparency and accountability. And I would just again highlight, if any listeners on the webinar have a particular interest and they want to delve deeper, I would recommend having a look at the website of the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, so IPCO, as they're commonly known. And this was a body which actually was founded as a result of Lord Anderson's recommendations. Similarly, I think OSINT tools and techniques may inadvertently perpetuate bias or discrimination against certain individuals or groups. And this is, I think, particularly acute or has the potential to be problematic when it's overlaid with artificial intelligence capabilities. So Dwayne touched on these earlier, and there's lots of reasons to be really positive about AI. It can absolutely speed processes up, sort of lift the mandrolic burden that would otherwise sit on individuals and free them up to actually do the intelligent human decisioning piece. But it does also present some risks. So, for instance, a risk of amplifying existing biases or stereotypes, which could lead to unfair targeting or profiling of individuals based on a range of factors like race, ethnicity, gender, political beliefs. I think what we need to do to address this is we have to be alive to this possibility, and we have to consciously and actively take steps to ensure that we're developing transparent and trustworthy AI models, which are explainable and not simply black box solutions. So I think, Dwayne, you may have touched on this earlier, I think, at the start of the conversation. So by that, I mean AI, where you can literally open the bonnet, check the engine, tweak it, change it, customize it. And this is the way that you demonstrate compliance. You can reassure auditors and build trust with both those who are using those tools, as well as those that are affected by it. Again, there's loads and loads of really useful information out there on the web. So there's loads of self-learning if anybody wants to do some more of that around data ethics, AI. I mean, I would point to, not least because he's an awesome individual, but our Vice President, Reggie Townsend, he heads up our data ethics and AI practice and our data for good practice. And if you Google him, you'll find a whole load of really useful links. And then finally, I suppose the flip side of the argument is we have to balance all of this against the fact that, as we've discussed at length in this webinar so far, OSINT provides a really, really rich seam of intelligence. And it's important for investigating crimes and protecting our citizens from a wide range of harms. So arguably, there's a moral imperative to use the best assets, resources, capabilities that are available to us, and in order to do this as effectively as possible. So notwithstanding the points that I've already made there in terms of like some of the ethical considerations, the concerns, I'd reprise the sort of the thrust of General Hockenhall's Russie speech that he gave in November 22 in light of the still relatively new situation that was emerging in Ukraine at the time, and ask, why would we not be using this information? Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I think it's also important to mention that the sort of outcome of this capability is likely to have implications for things like public trust too. And on my second point on challenges, it's important to emphasize kind of how we probably should be thinking about OSINT more formally in terms of a capability that can really be added to an integral part of a wider intelligence skill set amongst a variety of organizations within national security. So on more of the skills side then, Dwayne, coming to you, can you go into current approaches to that training and upskilling, both the security community, but also private sector as well, to how we can sort of better leverage OSINT capabilities?
Sure. I wouldn't mind actually diving into a little bit in the previous question as well, if that's okay. So yeah, maybe I'll just answer it all together. And it is kind of related as well. I was thinking about the legal frameworks, and we could probably have a whole webinar on AI and ethics, of course, probably have a whole day-long webinar on AI ethics. And I've thought about this deeply in multiple jurisdictions. I set up our office in the US and lived there for a couple of years, and there you're dealing with the Constitution, the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy. In Australia, we have the Privacy Act and the privacy principles. More recently, in setting up our UK office, of course, being in compliance with things like GDPR, understanding legislation like RIPA, Regulation of Investigative Powers Act, because, especially in our tool, I mentioned before that we're a very targeted tool, collecting information that generally people put voluntarily online, and then we can collect that information, but in storing that, we have to be in compliance with GDPR as a data processor. And this is front of mind for me because, I spent several hours yesterday going through a GDPR training refresher. So I guess my first point is being in compliance with GDPR is really important. I think ethical AI is really important. I know the US Department of Defense have issued ethical AI principles. The UK MOD has issued the UK's Defence AI strategy. And it does, you can Google it, you can look it up. It was released in 2022. And it does pick up on some of the things that Maria was even saying. How do we ensure that the human is still making the decision? Caroline was talking about explainable AI, because maybe just to take a little side note between explainable and black box AI. Black box AI is when generally a human can't understand why an AI has given a certain answer, because it's too complex. Whereas explainable AI is, training an image detector to detect a gun, and it finds an image of a gun, then that image goes to the analyst, and then they've found an image with a gun in it. And they can explain why the AI has found an image of the gun, so because they have that image in their hand. And so how do we ensure that the biases are being removed? How do we ensure that the AI is explainable? How do we ensure that the human is actually making the decision? Now, to segue to the question you actually asked, right? Training, of course, is really important, because just letting people loose on the internet and saying just find out what you can is not really a discipline. And what Maria was talking about before is, how do we create this as an actual profession, and how do we standardize that if we know someone's an OSINT analyst, how do we know they have the right skills of the next OSINT analyst next to them? Of course, I can come in and plug our own training here, but there is a range of training from high-quality providers in open source intelligence that can range from, here's how you do it manually. Here's how Maria was mentioning before. You could be looking at Google Street View, Google Maps. You see people do it all the time. They'll go to a certain location on the street and try and figure out where the Wagner soldiers are based on the hill and the tree that are behind them, and then match that to Google Street View. And you can do that just in a Google browser, and it's probably more efficient and safer and less difficult from actually going yourself to that particular location in Ukraine, for example, because you can do it from your lounge chair or your office chair, really. To sort of plug using tools, of course. So getting the training is right, but then using tools helps you do things like standard operating procedures. It helps you manage some of the things that Maria was talking about before. How do you do it safely? How do you tie together that information? How do you do it ethically? And what I mean by that is if it's auditable, so just setting someone loose on a Google Chrome browser, looking through tabs and searching Google Maps is not very auditable. How do you ensure that access for the tool might be only available when they're actually at work, and then they're not actually searching information they shouldn't be searching? Because the types of capabilities are very powerful. So you want to make sure that they're actually just using it to do their job, and it's standardized. And especially, it's not just making you more efficient, it's also making it sure that if we ever need to trace back to how we found that piece of information, it's still there. Because we've all done this before. You grab the URL of a certain place. Like, let's say you grab the URL of a news site today. So if you go back to that news site tomorrow, the content's going to be different. And then you go back the next day, the content will be different. If you can actually capture that information in an auditable fashion that says, this analyst captured this information on this day, you can actually have an audit trail of how you got that information. So I really think those are the key things. Just to maybe recap, yes, we're probably not there as OSINT as a profession yet, and it's probably a bit diverse what the skill set is. There's no sort of standard thing. Yes, there are, courses that some are great, some are ordinary, but there are great courses out there that people can do to become an OSINT analyst. But arming yourself with a tool to actually help solve some of these other problems, not just save you time, but also ensure that you're using explainable AI, ensure that you're using AI ethically, ensuring it's all auditable, ensuring your standard operating procedures are automated. So it's this analyst plus the machine working together. And just while it pops into my head, I wanted to pick up on another thing on GDPR, and Caroline mentioned it before around insider risk and pre-employment screening. Within GDPR, we want to make sure there's a lawful basis for collecting this information. And when you can track that there's a lawful basis for collecting that information, because our customer is a law enforcement customer performing an investigation into the organised crime gang, collecting that information, storing that information in a reliable way in something like a pre-employment screening, I just want people to keep in mind that you are actually collecting information that is publicly available. Everyone can get from a Chrome browser if they want. We streamline that process. But also under GDPR, this would be a situation where somebody would give consent. So, for example, if someone's applying for a security clearance, if somebody wants to access a secure facility, we're talking about people that work at, at the airport, and we want to make sure that they're not connected to the organised crime gang when they apply for their, their card to get access to that side of the airport, for example, where they're collecting. You could imagine packages coming in, and they're sort of streamlining those packages off to their organised crime gang mates. These are the people that you don't want within your organisation. So you make sure you get their explicit written consent to say, look, we're going to find out what we can about you online. It's public. It's what anyone can get, and we'll do that as part of our screening. And in that screening, you can then find those hidden connections that they might not want you to know about, or they might think are hidden enough. So I'm sorry if that was a long rambling answer.
No, very
key points that are around ethics and training and everything. So,
of course. A very, very big delve into the topic, but very insightful nonetheless, Dwayne.
Right.
In the interest of time, I think we can move into the audience Q&A, and there doesn't actually seem to be too many questions in the chat, which could only mean that you've all answered my questions brilliantly. There is a comment from David Page, which reads, trust and verification is easily lost with OSINT when policing is looking for help. One day false information will be fed in en masse and made easy to find. So maybe we can just pick that up as a closing question. Maria, coming to you first, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point for several reasons. The main one is that's already been done. Not necessarily from because of police, but because it has been for decades a quite known tactic that the Soviets would use. So they would just put false information out there on purpose to make you think that a situation would look different from how it is. Dare I say it, they're still doing that. And so that is not something new. That doesn't mean that we don't have to think about it, but it does mean that it is already there, that is already being done, either through disinformation or misinformation, and we're still doing pretty well. So when false information is out there, that then doesn't mean that you cannot do that you cannot do good intelligence anymore, that you cannot conduct great investigations. You just need to make sure that your analysts are really good, and that they have that knowledge in their head that they have to verify whatever they do, and that they have to make sure that they write down or otherwise document what it is they're doing, so that there is an extra level of checking there. But yes, feeding in false information or just false information being out there, that is a problem that is sadly a big problem already. The one thing I would say is, if that gets worse, then we probably need to work towards developing more formal mechanisms for how do we go about that? How do we go about these? How do we go about these verifications, if that makes sense? But even if you don't have false information fed into a situation, it's still pretty easy to make mistakes. It's a silly example, but it's the one example where I can categorically say that what they were saying is not true, right? So as an example, I was working for a think tank that was working on increasing resilience in different countries against Russian disinformation. This was back in 2017. The Russians did not like this, and they hacked us. I think the UK government a couple of months ago finally said, okay, yeah, this has happened on quite a large scale, that quite a few people were targeted, but our organization was part of that. And so what did they do? They hacked into our SharePoint, put everything online, indeed people talking about GDPR. That's an absolute nightmare from that perspective. But then what they also did was add false information to that. So they added information in there that wasn't from us. They just made these documents up and they put them in there. Then what happened, that picked up some public interest of people saying, oh, these spooks, they're working for the UK government, and they're doing, all this spy work, and it's all terribly interesting. Of course, that wasn't the case, but because of all that false information that was put out there, it really made it seem like that. Then what happened was, because there was more information out there and more public interest, you had this site called Wikispooks. And so what people started to do, indeed, perhaps not the best analysts on the planet, but they started gathering that information and they started building profiles on all of us. But again, because they were both not the best intelligence analysts in the world or just general people in the world, and because there was false information out there, the profiles that they built on us were absolutely wild. For me, for example, they thought I was a 75-year-old man who was running a deep state from his pub. But as I said, a silly example, but the one example which I can categorically prove that not to be true. But just as a little, anecdote to say, look, this sort of OSINT research is just really hard, and false information being fed in is sadly not new, and so we just have to be mindful of that always.
Thanks so much, Maria, and I think a good place to close as we're coming up to the hour. So just wanted to formally end today's session. So a big, huge thank you to Dwayne, Caroline and Maria for joining us as our speakers today. It's been a really insightful discussion and clearly a lot of work left to be done in the space as well, despite how far we've come already. If you wanted to learn more about kind of techUK's work in the space or our national security programme, feel free to get in touch with me. It can also be a way of getting in touch with any of the speakers from today's session. So my email is both on the techUK website, but we'll just drop it into the chat as well. And my inbox is kind of always open. Any questions that we didn't pick up from the chat, I will also share with speakers and see if we can get any written responses to those as well. Like we said at the beginning, the session will be recorded and available soon, so you can always come back and rewatch the discussion from today. A big thanks once again to all speakers and audience members for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.